Seville, 1627. The harbor is alive with the chaos of arrival. A Spanish treasure galleon, the San Felipe, cuts through the Atlantic swells after 4 months at sea. Its hold contains what empires dream of: 847,000 pesos of silver, 200 bars of gold, emeralds from New Granada, pearls from the Caribbean. The captain stands on deck and watches the city lights emerge from the darkness. He does not yet know that every piece of metal in his cargo has already been spent. Not metaphorically, literally. It has been pledged, mortgaged, and committed to creditors who are waiting in counting houses across Europe with ledgers open and calculation in their eyes. The ship has arrived as a slave to debt, not as a messenger of triumph. In Madrid, in the royal palace, King Philip IV sits in a chamber lit by candles that cost more than most men earn in a year. Before him lies a document from his treasurer. The number at the bottom would make a lesser man weep. The Spanish crown owes 400 million ducats. 400 million. To put this in perspective, the annual tax revenue of all Spanish territories combined amounts to 12 million ducats. The mathematics are not complex. They are brutal. Spain is so deeply indebted that its creditors now own the future. Not metaphorically, literally. Every decision the crown makes, every war it fights, every territory it defends, every ship it sends across the ocean, all of it is committed to servicing obligations that can never be repaid. And nobody knows. This is the secret that will kill an empire. The Spanish people wake in the morning believing they live in the greatest superpower the world has ever known. They believe their nation commands respect from every throne in Europe. They believe the gold flowing from the Americas is evidence of divine favor, of Spanish superiority, of a natural order in which Spain sits at the apex. This is not what they believe. This is what they have been told to believe. And the truth, the actual truth, hidden in the ledgers of Genoese bankers and Venetian merchants, is catastrophically different. Spain is not wealthy. Spain is bankrupt. Spain has been bankrupt for decades. The empire is not expanding because it is strong. The empire is expanding because it must. Because the only way to service its debts is to acquire more gold, more silver, more territory, more extractable wealth. The machine requires constant feeding or it collapses entirely. And the men who understand this reality, the financiers, the bankers, the merchants who move capital across Europe, they are watching. They are waiting. They are calculating. Let us go back to understand how this happened. How a nation that seemed destined for eternal dominion became a slave to mathematics. The story begins not in Spain, but in Peru, specifically in a mountain called Cerro de Potosí. In 1545, a man named Diego Hualpa, an indigenous laborer, discovered that the mountain contained the largest deposit of silver the world had ever seen. The news spread like fire through Spanish America. By 1570, Potosí was producing more wealth than any city on earth. The output was staggering. Approximately 200 tons of precious metal flowed from Potosí every year. 200 tons, enough to transform an entire civilization, enough to reorder the hierarchies of power. And it did. The Spanish crown took the metal and made a calculation. Instead of investing this wealth into infrastructure, into manufacturing, into the kind of durable economic foundation that creates lasting prosperity, the crown made a different choice. The crown spent it on the present moment. The crown spent it on war. The crown spent it on empire. The crown spent it on the machinery of dominion. This would have been manageable if it had been self-contained. If Spain had simply taxed its territories and spent what it had would have had a functional, if expensive, empire. But Spain did something more ambitious. Spain borrowed against future shipments. The crown took the certainty of silver arriving from Peru and used it as collateral for loans from the banking families of Italy and Germany. Italian bankers, especially the Genoese, understood what was happening. They understood that Spain had access to unprecedented wealth. And they understood that the Spanish crown was a military power that would pay any price to maintain its position. The relationship that developed between Spain and its creditors was not a partnership. It was a dependency that wore the mask of mutual benefit. The Genoese bankers extended credit to the Spanish crown. The Spanish crown used that credit to wage wars, to defend territories, to maintain the infrastructure of empire. And the Spanish crown paid back those loans through the flow of precious metals from America. It seemed perfect. It seemed sustainable. It was neither. The mechanism worked only if three conditions remained constant. First, the metal had to keep flowing. Second, the amount flowing had to increase to meet growing obligations. Third, the creditors had to maintain their willingness to lend. All three of these conditions were built on an assumption that was slowly, inexorably becoming false. By the 1570s, the trap had closed. The Spanish crown had become dependent on the Genoese bankers in ways it could not escape. Every military campaign required credit. Every expansion of the bureaucracy required credit. Every defense of the empire required credit. And the Genoese bankers, who had lent with confidence, now held the Spanish crown in their hand like a bird that could not be released without crushing its wings. The king of Spain in this era was Philip II, a pious man, a man who believed he was doing God's work by maintaining Catholic supremacy across the globe, a man who made decisions based on religious conviction and strategic ambition. But Philip II was not making financial decisions anymore. The Genoese were. When Philip wanted to finance the conquest of Portugal, the Genoese extended credit. When Philip wanted to support the Spanish Netherlands against Protestant rebellion, the Genoese extended credit. When Philip wanted to build the Armada and invade England, the Genoese extended credit. By 1575, the situation had become untenable. The Spanish crown had borrowed so much that it could no longer service its debts through the incoming flow of metal. The gap between obligation and revenue had become unbridgeable. Philip II faced a choice that no king wants to face. He could either surrender power to his creditors, or he could do something unprecedented. He could default. On September 29, 1575, Philip II announced a suspension of payments. The Spanish crown would not be paying its debts. Not now, not soon. Not with any timeline that could be predicted. The announcement sent shockwaves through Europe. Banks failed, merchants lost fortunes. The carefully constructed confidence that had held the Spanish financial system together shattered like glass. But here is what is important. The default did not destroy Spain's military power. Spain's armies still fought. Spain's fleets still sailed. Spain's territories still obeyed the crown. The default was not a moment of weakness followed by recovery. The default was a renegotiation of power. The Genoese bankers who had been creditors became something else. They became partners in extraction. They became stakeholders in the Spanish Empire. And they made it clear that future credit would be extended only if the Spanish crown met certain conditions. Those conditions were not stated in formal treaties. They did not need to be. The Genoese bankers understood the nature of power, and they understood that the most effective power is the power that does not announce itself. The Spanish crown continued to receive credit. The flow of loans did not stop. But the loans now came with an implicit agreement. The crown would prioritize the repayment of debts above all other considerations. The crown would structure its empire, its military campaigns, its territorial administration, all of it around the imperative of maintaining cash flow to satisfy creditors. In other words, Spain became a machine for extracting wealth from America and transferring that wealth to the bankers of Europe. The Spanish king was now the chief executive of an enterprise whose purpose was not to build an empire, but to service debt. This had consequences that rippled through Spanish society in ways that nobody anticipated. The Spanish merchant class, which had once been innovative and competitive, began to decline. Why would a merchant build a factory or develop a trade route when the most lucrative investment available was purchasing government bonds backed by Peruvian silver? The incentive structure of the empire was completely backwards. The most secure, the most profitable, the most attractive investment was not in production, but in extraction. Not in building, but in taking. The agricultural sector withered. Spanish farmers, already burdened by heavy taxation to support the military, found themselves unable to compete with cheaper grain imported from other parts of Europe. The textile industry, once vibrant, declined as Spanish capital flowed toward financial instruments instead of productive infrastructure. The craftsmen, the artisans, the innovators who might have built Spanish prosperity, they found their world becoming increasingly marginal. Meanwhile, the indigenous population of Peru and Mexico was being worked to death in the mines. The Spanish crown, desperate to maximize the flow of silver to pay its creditors, pushed the labor systems of America to breaking points. More natives were forced into the mines. More natives died in those mines. The death toll rose into the millions. And the silver kept flowing, shipment after shipment, an endless stream of metal purchased with an endless stream of suffering. What is extraordinary about this period is how the Spanish people, and even the Spanish elite, did not understand what was happening. They saw the treasure ships arriving. They saw the gold and silver entering Spanish ports. They saw the churches being built, the palaces being expanded, the armies being equipped. They saw all the external manifestations of wealth and power. What they did not see was the ledger. They did not see the columns of numbers showing that the metal arriving was not Spanish wealth. It belonged to creditors. The gold that was being minted into Spanish currency was not Spanish currency at all. It was the currency of debt, stamped with the seal of empire, but owned by the bankers who had financed its acquisition. The inflation that followed was staggering. As the amount of precious metal in circulation increased without a corresponding increase in goods and services available for purchase, prices began to rise. By the 1580s and 1590s, Spanish inflation was outpacing inflation in every other part of Europe. Prices in Spain were doubling every few years. A peasant's wage, which remained relatively stable, suddenly could not buy what it had bought a decade earlier. Meanwhile, the Spanish crown, desperate to service its debts and unable to reduce its spending, resorted to the debasement of currency. The Spanish real, which had once been a standard coin of pure silver, was gradually adulterated with base metals. A coin that was once 100% silver became 90% silver, then 80%, then 60%. The crown was literally taking Spanish currency and destroying its value to pay its obligations in the short term. The people felt this. They did not understand the mechanism, but they felt the effect. A day's labor bought less food. The cost of housing rose. The cost of clothing rose. The standard of living, which should have been rising with all this incoming wealth, actually fell. And the crown's response was to spend more, to wage more wars, to defend more territories, to extract more resources from a population that was already barely surviving. The Spanish Armada of 1588 is taught in schools as a military enterprise, a great undertaking, a moment of national ambition. It was actually a financial desperation masquerading as strategy. The crown needed to defeat England, not primarily because of religious conflict or territorial ambition, but because English privateers, with the tacit support of the English crown, were attacking Spanish treasure ships. The treasure ships were already mortgaged to creditors. The metal they carried was already spoken for. When privateers sank a Spanish galleon, they were not just stealing gold. They were destroying the collateral that backed Spanish loans. The Armada was sent to secure the sea lanes. It was an investment in the supply chain of Spanish debt, and it failed. The Armada was destroyed. The cost of building it and losing it added billions of ducats to the Spanish debt burden. Philip II, now an old man, died in 1598, having spent his entire reign servicing obligations to creditors. His son, Philip III, inherited not a kingdom, but a machine for extracting and transferring wealth. The new king was weaker, less capable of managing the enormous complexity of the empire. The debts continued to accumulate. The crown continued to default on portions of its obligations. The Genoese bankers continued to renegotiate terms, always extracting more, always demanding more security, always making it clear that the Spanish crown existed at their pleasure. By the early 1600s, Spain was still nominally the dominant power in Europe. It still controlled vast territories. It still sent fleets across the oceans. It still commanded armies. But something fundamental had changed. The underlying reality had inverted. Spain was no longer a power that was growing stronger. Spain was a power that was slowly, systematically being hollowed out. The rival powers watched and learned. The Dutch, in particular, understood exactly what was happening. They saw how the flow of precious metals from America had created an illusion of wealth that concealed a catastrophic structural weakness. And the Dutch made a different choice. Instead of building an empire on extraction, they built an economy on commerce. Instead of relying on the flow of natural resources, they built manufacturing capacity. Instead of being dependent on a single source of precious metals, they diversified their sources of wealth. While Spain was fighting to maintain its control over America, the Dutch were quietly building a commercial empire in Asia. While Spain was spending its wealth on military campaigns to defend territories it could not afford to lose, the Dutch were investing in infrastructure, in manufacturing, in the development of new trade routes. The wealth that the Dutch generated was not dependent on the continuation of a single commodity supply. It was generated through the productivity and ingenuity of the Dutch people. The contrast became more apparent as the century progressed. English merchants began to outcompete Spanish merchants in trade routes that Spain had once dominated. Dutch ships began to infiltrate Spanish territories in America and Asia, stealing market share that Spain believed was permanently secured. French merchants began to establish themselves in regions where Spain had expected exclusive dominance. And still, the Spanish crown could not change course. The structure of the empire was locked in place by debt. Every attempt to reduce military spending risked losing territories, which would reduce the flow of precious metals, which would make it impossible to service debts, which would cause creditors to foreclose. The only option that remained was to continue spending, to continue fighting, to continue the extraction of resources from America. The mechanism by which Spain was destroyed is important to understand because it was not dramatic. It was not a single catastrophic moment. It was a slow, methodical, relentless process of suffocation. Every year that passed saw Spain becoming slightly weaker, slightly more dependent, slightly less capable of changing its trajectory. The Catalan Revolt of 1640 revealed how far the situation had deteriorated. Catalonia, which had been one of the most economically vital regions of the Spanish Empire, rebelled against the burden of taxation and military obligation. The Spanish crown, desperate to maintain control and still more desperate to maintain the flow of resources to pay creditors, responded with brutal military force. But the use of military force required spending, which required more debt, which required more promises about the future, which could only be kept if the flow of resources continued. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but Catalonia was permanently damaged. The economic vitality that had made Catalonia valuable was destroyed in the fighting. And the Spanish crown had spent vast sums of money to maintain control over a territory that was becoming less and less valuable to the imperial system. Meanwhile, the Portuguese, who had been conquered and incorporated into the Spanish Empire, rebelled as well. The Portuguese War of Independence, which began in 1640, was not just a political separation, it was an economic amputation. The Portuguese territories represented a significant source of colonial wealth. Their loss meant a reduction in the flow of resources available to service Spanish debts. By the middle of the 17th century, the machinery of Spanish imperial power was beginning to seize up. The resources flowing from America, while still substantial, were no longer sufficient to meet all the obligations that had accumulated. The crown was forced to default again, and then again. Each default made it harder to borrow. Each reduction in available credit made it harder to wage wars. Each lost war meant lost territories. Each lost territory meant less resources. Less resources meant less ability to service debt. Less ability to service debt meant more defaults. The War of Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 and lasted until 1714, is presented in history texts as a diplomatic crisis. Multiple powers competing for the Spanish throne waged war to determine which royal house would inherit Spain and its vast territories. The war is told as a story of military campaigns and political maneuvering. The reality is more complex. The War of Spanish Succession was a renegotiation of Spanish debt. The powers that fought in that war were not fighting simply to determine who would inherit the Spanish throne. They were fighting to determine who would inherit the Spanish obligations, who would be responsible for paying back the centuries of debts that the Spanish crown had accumulated, who would receive the territories, but also the liabilities attached to those territories. When the war ended, Spain had been partitioned. The Spanish Netherlands, which had been a source of wealth and military power, went to the Austrians. Spanish territories in Italy were distributed among various powers. Spain's presence in Europe was dramatically reduced. What remained was a smaller, weaker Spain, diminished in power but not diminished in debt obligation. The new rulers of Spain inherited the same problem that had destroyed the old rulers. They had access to the flow of precious metals from America, but that flow was insufficient to meet their obligations. The empire had been reduced, but the debts had not been forgiven. The structural problem remained, but the only change was that Spain was now less capable of managing that problem. The treasure ships continued to sail from America for another century. The flow of precious metals continued, but by this point, the metal was no longer primarily going to Spain. It was going to the global banking system, flowing through various channels to pay the obligations that had been accumulated over centuries of spending that the revenue from the actual resources could never support. The consequences of the Spanish financial collapse extended far beyond Spain. The inability of the Spanish Empire to maintain its military power created a vacuum that other powers filled. The British began to expand their colonial presence. The Dutch consolidated their gains in Asia. The French began to build their own imperial system. The world that emerged in the 18th century was a world in which power was no longer concentrated in a single dominant empire, but distributed among competing powers. This distribution of power, while creating a more balanced world in some senses, also created a more volatile one. The Spanish Empire, whatever its flaws, had imposed a kind of order. Once that order collapsed, the powers that replaced it competed for dominance in ways that would eventually lead to centuries of warfare and conflict. The Spanish people paid the price for the empire's financial collapse. The population of Spain, which had been among the largest in Europe, began to decline. Emigration increased as people sought opportunities elsewhere. The internal Spanish economy, having been hollowed out by centuries of focus on extraction rather than production, struggled to generate enough wealth to support the population. Famines occurred. Poverty increased. The nation that had once seemed destined for eternal dominion became increasingly marginal to European affairs. The indigenous populations of America paid an even steeper price. The Spanish Empire, in its death throes, actually increased the intensity of extraction from its American colonies, desperate to maintain the flow of resources that might delay its final collapse. Millions more indigenous people were forced into the mines. Millions more died. The social structures of indigenous America were completely destroyed, not as a result of conquest, but as a result of the financial machinery of empire trying to maintain itself against the forces that were grinding it to pieces. And the legacy persisted. Spain never fully recovered the position it had occupied in the 16th century. It never again became the dominant power in Europe. The financial decisions made in the 16th and 17th centuries, the decision to spend more than was being earned, the decision to borrow against uncertain futures, the decision to prioritize extraction over production, those decisions echoed through centuries, permanently altering Spain's trajectory. The tragedy of Spain is not that it was weak. Spain had the wealth of an entire continent at its disposal. The tragedy is not that it was conquered. Spain was not conquered by any rival power. The tragedy is that Spain defeated itself through mathematics. The empire did not fall to an enemy army. It fell to its own ledgers. It fell to the simple, brutal arithmetic of spending more than you earn, borrowing to cover the difference, and then discovering that the debt structure you have created cannot be serviced by the resources available to you. The Spanish Empire had something that almost no other empire before or since has ever possessed: access to an essentially unlimited source of precious metals. If that was not enough to create lasting prosperity and power, then the problem was not with the resources. The problem was with how those resources were used. Spain used its resources to maintain an empire based on military dominance and territorial expansion. It used its wealth to wage wars instead of building infrastructure. It used its abundance to create dependency instead of strength. It treated the flow of precious metals as permanent rather than temporary. It treated power as something that would perpetually flow to those who possessed it, rather than something that must be constantly reinforced through productive capacity and economic innovation. And so Spain accumulated. It accumulated territory and obligations and debts and the weight of an empire that required constant feeding but could not feed itself. The empire became a trap. And Spain, the nation that had once stood at the apex of European power, became a casualty of its own success, destroyed not by enemy swords, but by its own inability to understand the difference between wealth and resources, between power and the means to maintain power, between the gold flowing in and the gold actually available to spend. The machine that had been built to extract wealth from America to pay for empire eventually consumed the empire itself, leaving nothing but the memory of dominion and the ruins of what might have been built instead. Spain did not fall to invasion or revolution or the superior force of rival armies. Spain fell because it confused having resources with knowing how to use them, and that confusion, replicated across centuries and compounded by creditors who understood the system far better than kings did, turned the greatest empire on earth into a monument to the dangers of believing that gold is forever.